I'm Caroline Hill. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Legal IT Insider, and I'm joined today by Rob Fitzgerald, who's founder and Managing Director of Arcas Risk. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Caroline. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me.
And thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited.
So we're here today. We're going to talk about a ton of stuff, but so security, to in a very umbrella term, security, but particularly we're going to be talking about vetting your supply chain risk, and we're looking at a few of the recent examples of hacks, I guess you'd call them, to call it very technical. So Microsoft Exchange, SolarWinds. But just to introduce you properly, so Arcas Risk, so it was founded in 2018 and headquartered in Boston. Is that right?
That's correct, Boston, Massachusetts.
Yeah. And in the spirit of full disclosure, so you and I have worked together.
Yes, we have. Yes, we have.
And what I like, you came recommended to me actually by a US CIO who we both know. And what I really like about the way that you describe things, and one of the reasons for asking you to be on the show, is because I really like the way that you, when it comes to talking about security, you break things down and you don't try to overcomplicate what's already a complicated area. Like I find the way that you talk about stuff very comprehensive. I don't know, do you find that a lot of people try to dramatize it or overcomplicate it?
I do find that, and I find it frustrating because it doesn't need to be that way. Obviously, technology is complex as it is. So the more we can either use analogies or break it down so that it's simple to understand, the better off everyone is, especially when it comes to security. And I love that we're talking today specifically about supply chain risks and in particular supply chain risks with law firms, because I think it's an area that a lot of firms haven't fully been able to get their head around, quite frankly, because it hasn't been a risk or a real threat in the past, not like it is today.
Well, no, and I'm really, I everything that when I speak to people and everything the conversations I have and things I read, it seems to echo that. So, and I think it seems to be something that really should be top of agenda. So we're going to look at a couple of the recent high-profile attacks. I think we'll do it in the most recent one. It seems a bit like the wrong order. I'm just kind of going present day backwards. But so obviously huge repercussions from the Microsoft Exchange attack. So that Microsoft said at the start of March that it detected multiple zero-day exploits. Do you want to just tell us a bit more? I think that some people seem to talk about it without a full comprehension of what happened. So I wondered if you could just help us just at a high level explain what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably multiple things to think about, right? Is that Microsoft Exchange as a software program has been around for a long time, and the code that was written has been around quite frankly for a long time. Especially the environment that was specifically attacked, which was Microsoft Exchange on-prem, inside of offices, right? Not in the cloud, and so what ends up happening is, for many different reasons, over time, software code can become vulnerable, or holes or mistakes can be identified that maybe when they were first written didn't exist or weren't exploitable because of compute power or time or other types of resources. They have now, now today, or as of March, became exploitable. And someone identified that. There's still discussion on who that party or parties are or were, and intentionally went out and tried to exploit the vulnerabilities in those code. And quite frankly, they found 3 or 4 specific vulnerabilities in the way the code was written. And with new compute power and new software, they were able to open the doors. I mean, the most simple way to think about it is if you think of a building with lots of doors and each one has a specific key. They were able to find a key or a skeleton key that could open up 2 or 3 or 4 doors that allowed them into the system. Now, the problem is Exchange holds all of your email, many documents that you're emailing back and forth, as well as access to your entire core system, your Active Directory, in which case, if it's exploited, it's easy for a trained malicious actor to be able to move and capture your entire environment, that's exactly what we saw happen and play out in March. And quite frankly, that's what we saw happen with SolarWinds as well, right?
Yeah. Well, let's go on to talk about it. Because so I was going to ask you. So SolarWinds. So I quite like the name. So it was Russia's Cozy Bear. I shouldn't probably like that name, but so they gained access to government and other systems through it was a compromised update to SolarWinds Orion software, wasn't it?
That's correct.
So. So they compromise the infrastructure of SolarWinds. So tell us a bit about it, and then I'd love to hear. I don't want to. What we're going to go on, just if you're listening in. So we're going to go on to talk about. Rob breaks things down really well in terms of what you need to do to be prepared, right? So so if you're listening in and you're a law firm, what we're going to come on to talk about is the kind of different stages. There's kind of 4 key stages that we're going to come on to talk about. So there's visibility, security, control, remediation, and then we're going to talk about vetting. How the really sort of the red flags and the things that you need to be looking out for vetting your supply chain. So there's a ton of, Rob's got a ton of really interesting, really cool observations. But just so to set the scene, so SolarWinds. So to tell us a bit more about that. And was it similar? Was it different? I think there's.
So it's funny because there's this is I in a way I feel bad for SolarWinds as an organization, right? This is the day of infamy for them, and so the reality is hackers were able to exploit code and then from that code be able to exploit systems within Orion, which were connected to other systems. And here we go, which is exactly what we want to be talking about and helping law firms understand as we move forward. And quite frankly, it's not just law firms. It's legal counsel in-house and helping them have conversations with their IT teams and their partners and IT teams. The reality is many organizations out there build their platforms, their code using public repositories, using open source code, using even proprietary code in the same way that SolarWinds is. And all of them are at risk if they don't take into consideration protections that they should be putting in place to make sure that it happens. So with SolarWinds, again, you have developers developing code using repositories. You have hackers figuring out a way to get into the repository to manipulate the code. That moves into the actual product when it moves from dev into production, and that creates a gap that if it's known, can be exploited. And of course,
it was.
Cozy Bear knew and did exploit that, right? And quite frankly, we may find out later on that it's more than just them that were aware or knew. And who knows how big that is? But it was such a large exploit and had such a large impact that it's concerning.
And also, so. Isn't it true you said that there are still machines? It was so extensive that the hackers have probably not got around. There's so many machines affected that they haven't even got around to a lot of them yet.
Especially with Exchange, we noticed that so many machines were hit that there is no way that within the periods of time. In fact, I spoke with CIOs that were struggling because they were running Microsoft Exchange on premise in their buildings because of legacy architecture and tools and platforms that had to use Exchange, that could not use O365. And so they were struggling because it was a balance of, if we remove Microsoft Exchange, if we turn this off, we lose production, or we lose, our faxing system, or we lose whatever it is. And so you had organizations all over the world in this battle between what can we do to protect this and as quickly as possible remediate, but we can't turn it off right now. It cannot be turned off right now. And I spoke with multiple CIOs of global companies and small companies that were struggling with this. I mean, sometimes it was, it managed the time tracking system, the punch clocks in different factories. Well, that's it. That's you need to keep it.
They've got so clever, haven't they? I mean, so it was kind of ironic with SolarWinds that they're a network and applications monitoring platform.
Right.
And I mean, it's extremely clever.
No, it is. But if you remember, 2 or 3 years ago, there was an attack. APT10 was coming out and attacking MSPs around the world. They were attacking MSPs using a very similar thing to. They were using a similar strategy to what the attackers did with SolarWinds Orion. Different methodology to get there, but needless to say, when you are building networking tools that are embedded in environments and shared with other organizations, they're a ripe target to go after, because once you're in, you're not in on one company, you're in on dozens, hundreds, thousands.
And the government, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I can't get too, I'd love to talk about this part all day with you, Rob. So there was Firefly that was affected, there were governments. I mean, that was probably from SolarWinds, wasn't it? But but the reach has been huge.
We're 5 years from now, we will still be cleaning up that mess. We'll be finding boxes that are in an office in the middle of nowhere, right? It's or in the basement someplace in Bristol or something, where all of a sudden people will look and go, oh my God, had no idea that this was running Orion, had no idea this was, what is this Microsoft Exchange box doing in our environment? And look, just in 2021, we've seen stuff come out from SonicWall, from Fortinet, from Veeam, from Dell. It's not just one specific product. And these vendors, these product vendors, the tools, the software companies, they're struggling right now because they're trying to build the best product possible as fast as the market is demanding of them. And so there's this balance of, we're trying to deliver. I mean, think of a fast food restaurant. We're trying to bring you as much as possible, and at the same time, it's a battle, because they're on the back door. They're fighting off people trying to break in and steal their code and steal their IP.
So tell me, so let's talk about the stages. So I guess let's put this in a little bit of context. So this is if you are a law firm, I mean, or it could be a corporate counsel or whoever. So you know that obviously there's been MS Exchange, there's been SolarWinds. We haven't actually talked about the NotPetya, but obviously there was DLA, the attack that got affected DLA, that was NotPetya, which was very similar, wasn't it? It was a Trojanized HR system, I think, from memory. So the first stage that if you're advising people, the first stage you tell them to look at visibility. What does that mean?
So I think we talk to our clients a lot. If you can't see it, you can't protect it, you can't fix it. And so asset management becomes so critical as organizations move forward. Know what boxes, what computers are on your network, know what software is on those computers, track those closely, right? Monitor activity of computers that are sending and receiving communications of different kinds, and what types of communications those are. I'm not suggesting that organizations need to be super nosy and know what specifically Rob or Caroline are typing, but be aware of what type of traffic Caroline's computer sends out or Rob's computer receives, and the types of days, the range of type of day that it has. If my computer is sending information to a rogue nation IP address at 3 a.m., the organization needs to know, the law firm needs to know. But also, from a visibility standpoint, law firms, corporate counsel need to understand what their supply chain risk is, who has access. So it's not just an organization looking at the machines within their environment. It's understanding which other organizations or individuals, HR consultants, for example, and I'm not picking on HR, but that's not Petya, right? I'm not picking on them. I'm using them as a known example, or payroll companies or copier maintenance companies, photocopier, like know what they have access to inside your environment and understand what they have for security protocols as well. Okay. Absolutely important to understand that, because this is that supply chain risk, right? It's one thing leads to another to something really bad. Okay. And that's what we want to avoid.
Do you know what? I think we should definitely. I want to visit that in some depth, actually, because I think that that's something that I don't see happening. I don't see that law firms view it in that way. I don't think that perhaps they take this sort of supply chain approach somehow that perhaps other sort of organizations do. But so I'm going to come back to that. But so fine. So visibility. So how? So I guess how many? And if you suspect, I suppose, that you've been embroiled in one of these hacks, you need to know how many machines have been affected. Does that come under or sort of how big the problem is? Does that come by necessity from just understanding what's going on in your machines and having the visibility that you're talking about?
To be able to scope what the damage is if you're
just to understand the scale. I guess to understand the scale of the problem. If you suspect, for example, that you've been caught up, or if you have worries or concerns about being caught up, and you need to understand, and you've said before that you need to understand how big the problem is. I suppose that stems from understanding your environment, right? Like, is that, or is there any extra steps?
Absolutely. So right, we tend to talk to this in four terms, right? Visibility, security, control, remediation. Yeah. So understand what your environment is and understand what the damage is, right? Did you cut your finger or did you cut off your whole arm? Huge difference depending on if it's a paper cut or if it's a cut with a large blade, right? And then secondly, how do we secure that, protect that so that it stays to only the damage is contained, and then control it and start to clean up the mess, right? Like, how do we put in controls? The number one thing that, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, but the number one thing that we encourage organizations to do, because most organizations still have not done one of the simplest they have not implemented one of the simplest security things they can.
I'm going to say, do I get a prize?
Multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication. Or they do it partially, like they put a little Band-Aid on a big wound. It's like, let's put in controls. Now all of a sudden, we have the visibility, we have the security, we have the control, and we can completely manage the damage so that we can remediate and we know exactly what needs to be remediated. To your point, law firms in particular historically have not thought about things this way because they haven't had to. They have been, each law firm has a shared, very, very large generalization here, but a shared ideal of a kingdom upon their own, right? They are all their own kingdoms. The problem is that worked great for a long time, and I think actually probably helped the industry accelerate growth. Now we're at a point where organizations need to be aware that risks can come from their closest allies unintentionally. And that's the piece that when you think of how many different vendors or partners law firms have, you have e-discovery, you have background check services, you have directory and knowledge-centric services, you have outside counsel that is supporting a specific project, you have expert witnesses. I mean, the list
goes on, doesn't it? Yeah, it goes on. When you're talking about security, so you talk about, so that's about having backup as well, is that right? So you need to add, I suppose, I've talked to DLA, I've talked about what happened at DLA and the work that they did with their backup, but tell me about is that one of the most important things to make sure you've got adequate backup? And what problems do you see around that? Do law firms kind of go, oh, what are the key sort of challenges you find around there?
So I think in particular, law firms have a really unique challenge when it comes to, let's call it infrastructure resiliency and data backups, right? Where it's not just about having a backup. In fact, I worked on a project recently where they had data backups, and the data backups were encrypted because they were accessible through the network. They were not independently offline. And so it's about resiliency and backing up the data in a way that it can be accessible, even if the environment is completely destroyed. Historically, organizations haven't thought about that. With law firms, there's an even bigger risk because you still have all the e-discovery data, and you have business operations over here, and then you have client related data, and then you have e-discovery related data, which ties to different client data. In which case they have to think through what are their critical components and what does that look like, and how do we manage each of those uniquely, and how do we prioritize those, right? Like, those to me are some of the critical business things that law firms and legal in-house counsel need to be considerate of, because it won't surprise me. Now, I'm going out on a limb here, but it won't surprise me if we start to see over time specialized or targeted ransomware attacks around law firms or around litigation for whether it be hacktivism, whether it be politically motivated, whether it be economically motivated.
Yeah,
it makes sense. And
because I was going to ask you, because ransomware is now the play, isn't it? Right? Ransomware is that what you're seeing most in terms of the outcome of this type of activity, the activity that we've already referenced?
In fact, it is. I was speaking with a firm that I was on a project with about 6 or 8 weeks ago, and the client had a major attack. They had a handful of different, very specific security incidents happen, events happen all within the incident. No ransomware. And we were floored that there was no ransomware. It made absolutely no sense. Ransomware is so common. That is the first question that insurance companies are asking when they're getting calls from victims, right?
Yeah.
Is this a ransomware event? And ransomware creates a broad range of additional questions on how to manage it. And if you have a resilient infrastructure with data backed up appropriately, you don't have to pay the ransomware.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you need? I mean, there's so much to drill down to. Ransomware is like a topic in itself, but so do law firms typically need specific tools to protect themselves from ransomware? And also, I mean, maybe there's not enough time to go into this, but so is it true that the ransomware attack, the hackers have got even smarter and they're now auctioning off the data, right? I suppose that's a separate issue.
Absolutely. That's a separate issue, right? So how do I create pressure to be paid? What the bad guys will do is they will attack, right? So the malicious actors or the threat actors, whatever you want to call them, they will break into your environment. They will steal some subset of information or data, and then they will ransom your environment. And when you say, no, I'm not going to pay, they will either sell your data online or threaten to sell your data online until you as an organization make the business decision to pay.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a separate conversation. But I suppose by having backup, at least you in terms of the traditional form of ransomware, you're protected. In terms of control, so obviously that you're then to sort of going to, I'm revisiting, you've already talked about this, but I think it's really worth diving down a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So you've already talked about MFA, and like why? So I think you may have written in the piece that I wrote after we spoke. I think you said that you've worked with some very large law firms that don't use MFA. Am I right in remembering that? And also, why is that?
So yes, I have worked with multiple large law firms that have yet to implement MFA. And in part because historically they've seen it as inconvenient, or they've seen it to be unnecessary. A lot of organizations, and in particular law firms, don't fully appreciate the value of the pieces of information that they have access to. They understand it in a very siloed component, but across a broader range, they haven't. And candidly, setting up MFA historically has been difficult, although today I would argue that's no longer the case, and probably hasn't been the case for 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years. But there are some great solutions that are out there that are easy to implement, at least at the perimeter, at the network level, and then turn on and utilize at more and more levels. So, for example, if there was MFA around data backups, and you needed to use MFA to be able to get into the data backup system, well, then you wouldn't be able to corrupt the data backup system. But the IT team needs to have a strategy to roll that out to make sure that that is in place to get to the data backup server.
And you said it's a huge mistake not to have it. And it was interesting. So it seems to be that firms are potentially under the impression that they would have MFA for remote workers, but not for workers in the office. You're shaking your head.
We see this happen all the time. Like, we put MFA on for the VPN, but not for remote workers, but not for all the workers. But that's not. We talked earlier about partially implementing a solution. That's partially implementing a solution. It should be everyone. So look, MFA does 2 really important things. One, it provides a great level of protection. Is it perfect? No, but nothing is. But it's a great level of protection. The second thing it does is it provides visibility. So if all of a sudden you see Rob Fitzgerald, who lives in the United States, is trying to access his MFA token from a foreign country, you have an ability to call Rob and say, hey, Rob, are you traveling and in China or Russia or Iran or North Korea right now? Otherwise, you can flip that and see that, Rob is always logging in this place or in this time. In Massachusetts, he's in Boston. Perfect. So we know that that's good. Those logs are collected. So when an event happens, you can look and say, okay, let's look at all of our users. I almost said losers there. All of our users, and let's match up. Who could the biggest risks be? These are the machines that we need to see if they're compromised. But Rob, always logging in on the same machine at the same time and the same day in the same location, his machine's not at risk.
Do you know what? So we've typical for you, chatting, but we've pretty much run out of time. But so we've got a couple of minutes. This is my bad management of time. But so I think you've covered that. I mean, we've covered the 4 steps. And in terms of vetting, we said we'd revisit the vetting the supply chain, right? In the last sort of couple of minutes. Perhaps share your tips in terms of you're a law firm or any team, and you're really going to start thinking differently. What are the key things what are the key changes that you're going to make today in terms of the approach to your supply chain, in terms of what you're looking for? Do you start insisting on ISO? Or I know there's a lot to go into, but go.
The most basic things: come up with a questionnaire for all of your suppliers, and just ask some basic questions. Do you have an incident response plan? Do you utilize MFA? Do you have a SIM or SOC services to monitor for malicious activity? How do you manage your backup? Are your backups offline, or do you manage backups? How do you manage your backup plan? Those 4 or 5 questions alone will give you more than enough information to know what risk level your supplier is, high, medium, or low. And then you can look at what the services are those providers are providing, and you can determine, I mean, look, if the landscaper or the gardener doesn't have MFA or backup plan, I'm not sure you really need to care about that. You can say that's a low risk. But if your primary doc review organization partner doesn't, or your e-discovery firm doesn't have MFA, doesn't have a SOC SIM, doesn't have an IR plan, you should be concerned. And you want to be talking about this. And candidly, I think in particular with law firms, especially smaller law firms, taking the lead on this allows you to sell. So you're going to move out. If you're a law firm and you say, hey, we have MFA, multi-factor authentication, we have an incident response plan, we have a great backup plan, you can use that as part of your sales pitch when you're talking to your clients or picking up new clients. We take your data serious. We take your information serious. These are the things that we're doing. Go out there, find another firm that's our size, doing what we do, and see if they will respond the same way.
Yeah, because we're out of time, but the clients must be then turning this on the law firms and saying, "Are you doing this right?" And I'd be amazed if they're not.
Big ones are, but small and medium-sized clients aren't yet because they're not educated enough to know to ask. And this is where law firms have an opportunity to sweep up and win business.
Well, that seems like a really good note to leave it on. Rob, it's always great to chat to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Always.